Good morning. We know that others are still coming in, and I think we should leave the doors open if it's not noisy in the back so that they can be accommodated. Good morning and welcome to the Flom Auditorium, named after the late super lawyer and Wilson board member Joe Flom, a good friend of many of us. Judy Flom is in the front row. She has decided to spend a lot of time here, and we're delighted. We're putting in a bed in the corner so she can move in and enjoy the wonderful Wilson programming. You're about to see some of it. I am Jane Harmon, the president and CEO of the Wilson Center, and hope you will enjoy the sixth in the Wilson Center's series of national conversations, which today coincides with our thrice yearly Day at the Wilson Center. It is a pleasure to have many dear friends in the audience, members of our board, including our board chair, Ambassador Joe Gildenhorn, and his wife, member of the Wilson Council, Alma, the Wilson National Cabinet, our Wilson Alliance members, and I also, let's see, I don't see her yet, so never mind, but I do want to recognize Boeing, which is represented by Bob Vilhauer somewhere in the audience. Is Bob here? Where? There he is, as our global sponsor. Today is chock full of activities, beginning with this impressive panel that will examine the question, can America regain its competitive edge?
My colleague on the
Later this morning, a session will focus on the way immigrants are shaping America's character in the 21st century. We wanted to talk about the question of immigration in a non-loaded way. It doesn't seem, at least to those of us who work here, not about a mile up the road, that everything about immigration needs to be partisan and toxic. There are so many benefits from immigration. And at lunch, Tom Brokaw will deliver the third Hamilton Lecture, a series named, of course, for my predecessor here, Lee Hamilton. Tom's subject is the New Order of Public Service and the American Dream. That's a lot for 4 hours. For those of you new to the Wilson Center, let me add a few words on the center itself. Congress created us in 1968 with a view to honoring President Wilson with a living memorial rather than another statue or monument on the Mall. Wilson was the only president to have earned a Ph.D. In his day, he was a leading political scientist before becoming president of Princeton, governor of New Jersey, and two-term president. We have some Princeton aficionados around here. I would just note that in my day, Princeton did not welcome women. Wilson, except on weekends, before you ask. Wilson also wrote books on, okay, settle down, everybody. Wilson also wrote books on Congress and was one of only 3 presidents to testify before Congress. He testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in August of 1919 on the peace. The first president to appear before Congress was Abraham Lincoln in February 1862. He met with the House Judiciary Committee to assure them that no member of his family was involved in leaking a portion of his December 1861 message to Congress to the New York Herald. The third president to appear before Congress was, third president was Gerald Ford, who knew that? John knew that.
Yeah, I did know that.
That's impressive.
We testified on
How many other people knew that? Okay. Third president was Gerald Ford, who appeared in October 1974 to explain the reasons behind his pardon of former President Nixon. But back to the center, which brings together the two passions of Wilson's life by aligning scholarship with good policy. Our charter forbids us from advocacy, but not from creating a platform which I call a safe political space to engage a diversity of views to explore the toughest issues. One such issue is regaining America's competitive edge. As a recovering 9-term member of Congress who served on all the major security committees, I can tell you that our competitiveness is integral to many things, including our national security. In World War II, Franklin Roosevelt famously referred to America as the arsenal of democracy. American factories turned from cars to tanks, ships, and aircraft in a cascade of production that fueled Allied victories in Europe and Asia. Later, during the Cold War, I remember worrying about the balance of forces between the two superpowers. But the entire world watched America's democratic capitalist model outperform and outproduce its Soviet rivals. Now, as we confront competition from the BRICS, as well as from Europe and Japan, there are troubling signs on the horizon. 3 decades of trade deficits have left the United States as the world record debtor. The Defense Science Board warned not long ago about our semiconductor industry relocating overseas. In fact, we have already lost or are losing parts of our industrial base that are critical for everything from national security to future innovation. Many of you know that as a member of Congress, I represented Los Angeles' South Bay, a region I call the aerospace capital of the universe. In addition to the semiconductor example, I remember well and painfully how this country's security and export control policies in the 1990s virtually destroyed our domestic satellite industry, and how many aerospace and defense contractors were forced to diversify in order to stay afloat. Nowhere is the issue of maintaining our country's industrial base more critical than in aerospace, in my personal view. It is a huge economic driver, more important to California's bottom line than agriculture, and a key vector for innovation and spin-off technologies. But the challenges are many, from a gray tide of retiring rocket scientists to the hiring tug of tech titans like Facebook and Google, to a government that is disinvesting in research, which I think is I'm sure we'll hear about this today, and research and development, and doing too little to promote STEM education. In international student assessments, our high school students rank 25th in math and 17th in science. Mediocrity will not win the future. To do a deeper dive on what it will take to rebuild innovation and wealth generation in the U.S., we have a truly expert panel. Of course we do. You should already have their bios, so let me just be brief. Let me start with my dear friend, Norm Augustine, a Princeton graduate and professor, whom I first got to know in his role as CEO of Lockheed Martin. He was an industry giant then and has since added inches as professor, author, and visionary wise man for America's future. Is that good enough, Norm? Will that do?
Pretty good.
Oh, good. Okay.
Who were you talking about there?
As chair of the eponymous Augustine Commission, Norm was responsible for 2 rising above the gathering storm reports, parts of which found their way into a State of the Union address, led to the passage of 2 America Competes bills, and just as important, actual appropriations from Congress, a near miracle in today's Congress. It is also a pleasure to represent Governor John Engler. As you know, he now speaks for the leaders of America's top corporations. His earlier experiences as president of the NAM and governor of Michigan have given him an up-close and personal look at key aspects of American competitiveness. Deborah Wince-Smith, dressed for spring, is president and CEO of the Council on Competitiveness, and we're excited to have a strong woman on the panel. Under her leadership, the Council created the National Innovation Initiative, focused primarily on energy and exploring training needs, and most recently convened a summit on manufacturing. We're also privileged to have with us Jan Rivkin from Harvard Business School. An aside, my oldest son was a 1999 HBS graduate. Jan is the co-chair of the B School's Competitiveness Initiative and has made business strategy a specialty. I hope he will talk about a recent survey of Harvard business grads and their views on how to strengthen America's competitive edge. Finally, I have saved for last the 2 Wilson Center I've saved 2 that the Wilson Center claims as its own for last, Paul Vallis and David Wessel. As a distinguished scholar at the center, Paul is putting his formula for school reform in writing. He has plenty to write about. Paul has led school reform efforts in Chicago, Philadelphia, New Orleans, and today in Bridgeport, Connecticut. After major earthquakes in Chile and Haiti, Paul was called on to help rebuild the school systems there. He really is Mr. School Reform. And our moderator, David Wessel, is the Washington bureau chief and economics editor for the Wall Street Journal. In his columns, he has the gift of putting technical discussions into clear English to add some glitter to what many consider the dismal science. At the center, David wrote much of his book, In Fed We Trust, Ben Bernanke's War on the Great Panic. David will moderate this panel, and now let me turn the floor over to David Wessel. Again, welcome to the Flom Auditorium.
Thank you very much for that, Jane. It's good to be back here. I spent a couple of months here this year working on a book about the federal budget, and I think this is one of the places in Washington where intellectual capital is actually created while it's depleted almost everywhere else in town. And we've had conversations about competitiveness for my whole career as a business and economics reporter, which is more than 3 decades now. And I think that one of the things that makes it frustrating is that any panel of this size, 5 people, will have 5 different definitions of what the hell it means. So I want to propose that we start with a definition that Jan's colleague Michael Porter is using, and then go from there. The U.S., he says, is competitive to the extent that companies operating in the United States are able to compete successfully in the global economy while supporting high and rising living standards for the average American. And I think that's a kind of well-thought-out phrase because it conveys the fact that this isn't all about a race to the bottom and trying to cut our wages faster than the Chinese so we can steal 3% of their market share. And what we're going to talk about today, we're going to have a conversation about where are we in this endless quest to improve our competitiveness. Are we winning or are we losing? What have we done and what have we not done? And Jan, I'd like to start with you.
Great.
So if you were diagnosing the American economy, where are we competitive and where do we have things to worry about?
Yeah, I think that fairly clearly we're in danger with respect to both halves of that definition, the ability of firms to compete and living standards. And my views on this have been shaped by a survey we recently completed that President Harmon mentioned, where we asked our alumni to assess U.S. competitiveness by exactly that definition. And we got 10,000 responses. This is from people at the front lines of the global economy, every part of the economy, every state of the union, except for North Dakota. We had no respondents from North Dakota. 121 other countries. And what they said to us fairly clearly is that the U.S. faces a deepening competitiveness problem. That when they look at the U.S. today versus other advanced economies, they actually see an economy with great strengths. But when you ask them to compare the U.S. versus emerging economies and looking to the future, they get deeply, deeply worried. In fact, 71% of them said that they expected the U.S. competitiveness to decline in the next 3 years. They were worried about both the ability of firms to compete and the living standards half of that. They were particularly concerned about living standards, which makes sense in light of an economy that where household income is stagnant, where job growth has really dropped off. So the overall picture they painted was one where they didn't say the sky had fallen, but they were saying that there were pieces of the sky that were dangling, and we better get our act together and fix those pieces before they fall on our heads.
And what were the pieces, what were a few of the pieces that they thought were dangling?
Sure. So we asked them about a whole set of drivers of competitiveness, and the drivers fell into 3 categories. There were strengths of the U.S. economy that were seen as getting even stronger. Entrepreneurship, innovation, the university system, quality of firm management, vibrancy of the capital markets. There were strengths that were deteriorating, the infrastructure of the country, the availability of skilled labor. And in fact, when we asked our respondents who were involved in offshoring decisions why they stayed or left, the availability of skilled labor was more often a reason to leave the country than to stay. And that's sobering. And then finally, there were a set of weaknesses that were considered to be getting even worse. The ineffectiveness of the political system, the convoluted tax code, the legal and regulatory environment, and the K-12 education system, all areas in which this group has worked for many years and deeply.
So, Mr. Augustine, you've been at this a long time. Are we making progress or are we falling behind?
Well, we are behind. We're falling further behind. I think we're on a very slippery slope. The path we're on, I think, is clearly a downhill slope. It doesn't have to be that way. There are things we can do about it if we will show the will to do it. I think most people know, by and large, what needs to be done. One of the things that I think has happened is that we've all seen the manufacturing base gradually moving overseas. And there are a number of reasons for that. Other people in other countries are willing to work for less than the average American. In many areas now, they're better qualified to work. We have more regulation in our country than most other countries. Personal note on that, you may have seen that last summer I had the misfortune, along with Bill Marriott, that our grandchildren had opened a lemonade stand in Potomac without a permit, and I wound up with a $500 fine for having a lemonade stand on the front lawn. Just an example, I think similarly, other countries have what I would term a more reasonable legal system to work under. Today, U.S. companies spend over twice as much on litigation or legal costs as they spend on research, which is not a formula for success. We have one of the highest corporate tax rates in the world, probably first or second. And so we saw the manufacturing base move overseas. When manufacturing moves overseas, as an engineer, I'm an engineer by training, and incidentally, Jane, as you mentioned, a Princeton engineer, and you were wrong about one thing. You said women were welcome at Princeton on weekends. Actually, the quickest way to get kicked out would be to have a woman in your room after 7 p.m. on Saturday night. So,
I think they fixed that.
Have they fixed that now? That was a big problem for all of us. I guess there was a fear we'd be corrupted. So when you have the manufacturing base move abroad, the thing that tends to follow are prototype shops, the early production work. What follows that then is the design work and research laboratories. Today the research labs are moving overseas, and that's a path that is just fraught with trouble. And just to wrap up briefly with the point, R&D is so critical to our ability to compete in this world. There have been numerous studies that show somewhere between 50 and 85% of the growth in GDP the last half century was attributable to advancements in science and engineering, likely to be more in the current century. Similarly, 2/3 of the growth in productivity has been attributed to advancements in science and technology. And only 4% of our workforce are scientists and engineers in this country, but they disproportionately, vastly disproportionately, create jobs for the other 96%. And I'm not an economist, of course, but I did a little analysis of the data I could get for the last, I think it was 60 years, that showed that for every percent the GDP grew, you added about 0.6% to the workforce, jobs in America. And so if scientists and engineers create GDP, they also create jobs. And today we're absolutely losing it in terms of our ability to provide scientists and engineers. You may have seen where not long ago Steve Jobs told the president that the reason that he hired 700,000 people outside the United States was because he couldn't find 30,000 engineers in the United States. That's sort of what we're facing.
Let me ask you a bit about this manufacturing thing. So 88% of Americans work outside of manufacturing. We long ago passed the point where we were a manufacturing-dominated economy. Is the key to our competitiveness exclusively in cultivating manufacturing?
No, I don't think it is. I think manufacturing is very important for a couple of reasons. One, those jobs tend to pay better than the average job. Secondly, if you're interested and concerned about national security, as I tend to be, it's tough to win a war with a service economy. You've got to have a manufacturing base. And so from a military national security standpoint, I think it's important. But clearly, there are many other opportunities for good jobs in America. And so manufacturing is important. We've been losing ground in terms of number of jobs or the percent of the workforce. At the same time, it's not the only answer.
Deborah, you've been doing a lot of work on manufacturing. Where do you think public policy can have the biggest impact in the sorts of things that Mr. Augustine mentioned?
Well, first, I'll amend a little bit the competitiveness definition, because the other piece in this is the productivity growth, for the country. And so, the whole challenge around 21st century manufacturing is a conundrum, because we really have the emergence now of a whole new model for how things are being made. And we're not going to be using the workforce of the mid-1950s for 21st century manufacturing. We just at the U.S. Council brought together our CEOs and university presidents and labor leaders for really a 3-year effort to look at this manufacturing continuum. And we really defined it in a different way, that it's not just the making of the thing, it's the whole system, and services wrap around it, and it's part of the design. So it's a very sophisticated system. And the summit that we had in December that outlaid our comprehensive plan really looked at the talent, the technology, the investment, and the infrastructure. And just on the kind of overall macro issues to really revitalize our economy and our manufacturing base, we looked at the overall capital cost structure for U.S. companies. And of course, many of these companies are global enterprises. They have to optimize where they're going to work around the world. And we have a huge differential, sometimes up to 40%. This isn't just corporate tax. This relates to repatriation of profits, tax credits, also the regulatory environment that was mentioned. To have 14% of our GDP around regulatory imperatives is a huge disadvantage. So, the recommendations that we have proposed, some of them focus on these big macro issues, which of course are going to depend on a bipartisan Congress to move forward on, but very importantly, things that are already underway. So manufacturing's not dirty, dumb, dangerous, and disappearing. It's smart, safe, sustainable, and surging. And we are already on the cusp of seeing manufacturing hubs.
Bumper stickers will be available outside.
That's good.
Of manufacturing networks and hubs emerging in the country. And, Governor Engler and his leadership role in Michigan played a very important role in stimulating that in batteries and in fuel cells and things. So how we knit all those pieces together is going to be a big part of our work and building on what we've done on clusters. The other thing I'll say on the manufacturing challenge is that on the skilled workforce, I've mentioned we have to train differently, but we have a huge shortage of what are called middle skills workers. If you're a trained welder right now, and the head of the pipe fitters and plumbers is our labor leader, you go through that training, you're going to make $80,000 a year. And we have, we're crying for those. So at the end of the day, we have to look at this as a system, and there's not any one single bullet. But the other issue is it's a movement. And it'd be interesting to see how many people in the audience would recommend that your children go into the manufacturing world for jobs. It's actually very, very exciting, and it's something that's not, standing on the factory floor as building tires in Akron, Ohio, where I'm from.
Mr. Engel, I'm torn between asking you to talk about manufacturing, but I'd like to move it to another plane. When you represent a number of huge global companies now, and as we have learned the hard way, capital is pretty mobile in this world, and the technology is making it easier to do production overseas and stuff. When you talk, and we understand that a lot of these companies have interests other than what's good for the U.S. economy. They are now truly bigger than any one country. But when you talk to them about doing business in the United States and about what it takes to make the country more competitive, that is, given the competition, make more stuff here and pay better wages here, what are a couple of the things that you think are the real fulcrums, the real levers?
Well, let me just say that I think the CEOs who run the business roundtable companies, these men and women, almost to a person, are passionately interested in this country. I mean, they're almost all from America. Their families are here, and you're right. They run global enterprises that today recognize 95% of their customers don't live in this country anymore. And so there's certain kinds of enterprises where you actually have to go to those countries. If you're selling Pampers, Bob McDonald likes to say, the CEO Procter & Gamble, you've got to make those in those countries where those markets are. You don't ship those around the world. A little bit different if you're Doug Oberhelm at Caterpillar, and you're there you've seen that company actually bring some production back here because they've tightened up their supply chains. But I think they worry about several things, some of which have been discussed, about the quality of the workforce. They worry about a tax structure which, in effect, penalizes you if you make a lot of money offshore. Our tax policy in this country is that and I heard Mukhtar Kent from Coca-Cola use this example. he's in Malaysia, German companies there. They each pay the 20% Malaysian tax. And then the German company can take their profits and go anywhere in the world with those profits, including back to Germany. Coca-Cola can go anywhere in the world except back to the United States. If they come back here, they pay an extra 16% tax on top of that. And so that's part of the tax structure that needs to be dealt with. There's I think a and Norm's litany of issues of concern, they're all there. The point that I try to make in Washington, having spent most of my career at state level, is that it's well accepted and understood among members of Congress. I like to say most of them came from states. I'm not sure of all of them, but but having done that, there's an understanding how states compete one against the other. They knock each other silly trying to, come to Indiana, go to Tennessee, be in Texas, and here's all of the things we can do. We'll help on training your workforce. We'll help with infrastructure. We'll help with taxes. We'll do all of this stuff. Well, today, that competition, unfortunately, is ratcheted up. It's now nation against nation. And we're almost exclusively among the community of nations, one without a strategy to win that competition. We're still resting a lot on the glory days of the past, say, well, of course you'd want to be here. Well, not so fast. And I think that does then get into what's your legal climate, what's your regulatory climate, what's your tax policy, what's the innovation strategy, and a whole lot of things get into that mix today. And the fact that all of these customers are out there, and export controls, Jane mentioned that in her comments. That's just a little policy question. But we did a study when I was at the manufacturer, said there's $60 billion in exports potentially available if we'd upgrade export control laws. Instead, by failing to do that, we let the allies sell the same product that we make. And once they do that, they start winning market share. Once they win market share, then they're doing the innovation. And then back here, DOD says, well, we'll treat everybody, including our allies, equally. Well, guess what? Suddenly our business is saying, why are we in that area? And so, and I think to the point, the political process, and I'll just close on this, is so broken that we aren't making any of these decisions today. And for CEOs, the thing that just drives them nuts is the uncertainty. Tell me what the rules are. I'll see if I can play the game. But if I don't know what the rules are, I'm not even sure what the game is.
Let me push you a little bit on this tax question. I'd like to understand what exactly the Business Roundtable CEOs are looking for here. So there are at least two pieces. There's 100 pieces to it, but there are two pieces. One is you want a lower tax rate for business, and I think you're willing to make it revenue neutral, which means that you're willing to get rid of some deductions and credits and bonuses and all that. So A, is there as much consensus on the latter as on the former? And secondly, we live in a country that has trillion-dollar deficits. My judgment is we are not going to get out of this without more revenue. Are the CEOs willing to say that I'll pay more personal taxes but lower my corporate taxes?
I think that they are. Sure, that's part of it. They understand, and I think most Americans, sort of across the spectrum. I mean, I would say the 1%'s working hard and pulling a lot of the wagon today. But the reality is to fix our fiscal problems, it is not just you can take all of the money. We've all been through that math. It is the great middle class that you want them to have wealth in order to be able to pay taxes. You want them to have more wealth to pay more taxes. But you're going to have to deal with entitlements. You're going to have to deal with revenues, and economic growth is a factor. 1% increase in GDP is $1 trillion in revenue. So I like to tell people we're focused on that piece too. On the corporate tax specifically, the great quest is for certainty. Number one, we had 60 provisions of the tax code expire on December 31 of last year, 41 more scheduled to expire this December 31. We really don't even have a tax code anymore in the country. It's all expired. We would say make it permanent, get the rate down. On April 1, Japan officially has a lower corporate rate than we do, so we're number one in the world and not a ranking we desire. So we'd say do that, and given the fiscal condition, we've said as a concession, yes, we can do it on a revenue neutral basis, and we believe that by eliminating tax expenditures, credits, deductions. Some people call them loopholes. If you keep in the corporate bucket, we can bring the rate down, make it much simpler, at the same time have a competitive international
Well, when you sit
tax.
down with the Business Roundtable and you say, everybody in favor of lower corporate rates, everybody raises their hand. And then can you say, okay, can we agree on getting rid of some of the deductions?
Oh, no, I think that they've come a long way. There's a lot of realism there. I mean, what good is an R&D credit that's expired for the 14th or 15th time? I mean, that's not exactly an incentive, and so I think that there's a great desire to move beyond this, because there are a lot of other things as well, but we're so far. In '86, when the last time the tax code was modernized, we were far and away the lowest. Today, we're the highest, and just this week, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Mr. Osborne, was saying, well, Britain's going to lower their rate from 24 to 25 down to 24, because the corporate rate is the one measure that people use to track competitiveness, and that's what he said.
Mr. Vallis, feathered through a lot of the comments we've seen so far, and of course in every conversation about competitiveness, is this deep-seated angst about our K through 12 schools. And you've convinced me that we know enough to fix them and we can fix them. So convince them.
Well, let me just, the really good thing about speaking last is you can actually make some follow-up comments to some of the things the other speakers said. Having worked in state and local government for many, many years, let me point out that the focus at the federal level on tax reform obviously needed long overdue, but what's really strangling this economy is local governments and what's happening at the local government level. I mean, there are some state and city taxes when they are combined exceed the effective tax rate of corporate rate in Ireland. So at the end of the day, Illinois has 6,000 local governments. And between the taxes and the fees and the regulations, so you're only going to make so much progress at the federal level. But unless you attack the issue of local entitlements, I mean, what's killing and driving taxes, both local taxes and state taxes in state of Illinois, is the entitlements, and their governmental entitlements, and their public employee entitlements, and it's just basically, it's got a stranglehold on the local economy. So ultimately, you have got to address that issue too. Just imagine 6,000 local governments, or 1,200, or maybe it's 1,100 now, they've done some consolidating, school districts, each with their own taxing power, and these municipalities and these county governments, each with their own regulatory powers. So that issue needs to be addressed too. So I just want to make that comment. Let me answer your question by basically saying that what's happened in this, our K-12 system has always been inferior. It's always been substandard. What has compensated for the substandard K-12 system has been our advantages at the higher education level. And as the economies have grown, and as the Iron Curtain fell, and as the economies have been liberalized, countries have been catching up to our higher educational system. I read some statistics somewhere and of course I have to verify all my statistics and references for Ken. He doesn't let me get away with making generalities. But I think we're about to enter a phase where for the first time in history, the number of years our population will be in school will fall below the 50% average in terms of comparing us to other countries. So what's happened is we've been losing our competitive advantage in large part because of what's been happening at the higher educational system, and I think, and it's because the economies are growing and evolving. We wanted to knock down the Iron Curtain, we did. They liberalized their economies, now they're competitive. I mean, we had a great advantage when China was an economy that the government had an absolute stranglehold over, and people were having things rationed and things of this nature. But obviously things are changing, and so we have to compete, and we've lost that advantage. And obviously every single time we make it, we become a more inhospitable place for immigrants and things like that. We also begin to lose those advantages because we always had the benefit of being able to recruit the best and the brightest internationally because of the opportunities that we presented to them. Now, on the subject of education itself, the fundamental problem with the K-8 system is not that it suddenly got bad, it's that it failed to evolve. Two examples. The school day. I mean, it's based on the Farmer's Almanac. Who has a school day in the industrial world that is as short as ours, or a school year that is as short as ours, with perhaps the exception of Finland? Somebody told me on a panel the other day, well, Finland has a shorter day and a shorter year. And I said, yeah, and there's 4 parents raising every kid in the household. So obviously that's certainly an advantage. But the point is, and that was a presidential candidate, incidentally, someone who was running in one of the primaries. I knew I was never going to be his Secretary of Education. But the
Congratulations.
But so second example is the recruitment of teachers. Our K-8 system, K-12 system had a monopoly when our economy was closed to women and minorities, or much more restrictive, and when our economy had not been booming, where people were the need to hire the best and the brightest, did more to advance the cause of civil rights than perhaps the civil rights legislation itself. We were able to sit around and just wait for the best and the brightest among women and minorities to enter the teaching profession. Well, what's happened in the last 20 to 30 years is that has changed. Yet we still recruit teachers the same way we used to teach them, we used to recruit them, and we train them the same way we used to train them. Now, there's been some chips in that institutional structure through Teach for America and the New Teachers Project, attempts to recruit the best and the brightest and to bring them into the system. But those are just 2 examples of what puts us at a competitive disadvantage. So I think the key and the challenge is to not only modernize the system, but to give it institutional flexibility so it can continue to evolve. That's the fundamental problem. Government institutions, by their nature, resist change because you can just come in and give more funding. Where obviously in the private sector, competitive businesses fail, et cetera. We can't afford to allow schools to fail because at the end of the day, we're losing generations. So I think what ultimately needs to be done is you need to modernize your school system. And we know the best practices, and hopefully in the second round of questions, I'll be able to talk about those. But the key here is not only to bring those best practices to schools in the area of curriculum instruction, teacher recruitment, teacher training, creating a competitive educational system where you're recruiting superior school models, but you're also holding those models, be they charter schools, to a very tough and a very aggressive accountability standards, because everybody focuses on the schools in New Orleans and the extraordinary results of the charter school movement in New Orleans. Incidentally, the direct one schools have also improved significantly, but they ignore the fact that the state also opened charter schools outside New Orleans, and they almost all failed. So the point here is we've got to modernize our schools and create a more competitive school system while maintaining very high, uncompromising accountability standards. And we've got to create the institutional flexibility to allow the schools to continue to evolve, whether it's adopting the best practices, whether it's recruiting personnel, et cetera.
So it seems to me you've identified a couple of issues. One is the institutional structure is not suited to the task at hand.
That's right.
The second is we used to be able to have a whole lot of women and minorities going to teaching because they couldn't do anything else. Now they have many other opportunities.
It's much more competitive.
And the third is it's not that our schools have gotten worse, it's just that the labor market demand for skilled workers has gotten stronger faster than the schools have been able to.
Not only that, the socioeconomic changes are placing greater demands on the school system. The school system hasn't adjusted to it. The length of the school day and school year is completely, it has no relationship to the average work day or for the average work. I mean, who has a 180-day, or in some states, or in Hawaii, was it 155 days work year where you're working 6.5 hours a day or 6 hours, 15 minutes a day. You have weekends off, holidays off, Mardi Gras off, Jazz Fest off, the week off. I can go on and on and on. In New Orleans, we have close to 195 year school day. In Singapore, I think it's 270 days. I mean, if you were just looking at instructional time on task alone, you would say, oops, with the exception of Finland, there are...
It's dark there a lot, so
yeah,
that
that's right.
compensates.
It's dark there a lot, but so the kids have to be home studying. So clearly there are some glaring advantages. And what you need to do is you need to remove the obstacles. The obstacles that prevent you from designing a school day and a school year, from selecting the best practice models, from recruiting the best and the brightest, from promoting the best and the brightest. You have to remove those institutional obstacles to designing schools that benefit kids.
Okay, so on the theory that I'm capable of asking enough questions to depress everybody about the future of America, which is not neither my intent nor is it actually the right answer. Give us the short. So Paul, having fixed everything that's wrong with the New Orleans public school system, Paul's gone on to do a quick turnaround of the Bridgeport, Connecticut school system. in what has to be one of the most bizarre moments in governance. The state took over the city school system, and everybody knew the Supreme Court was going to invalidate that. So they gave you what? How many days?
Well, we thought we now, it looks like we'll have about 100 days to do it.
100 days to turn around the Bridgeport, Connecticut school system. So tell us a little bit about what you did there and give us some hope.
Well, the first thing we did was instead of trying to reorganize the district, we decided to deconstruct it. So we shut down the central office, and we presented a new organizational structure, and we basically rehired and reassigned according to that. Because what happens is governmental institutions evolve, and then and there might have been a logic to the organizational structure years ago, or decades ago, but that logic has become more distorted as things have changed, and as you reel from one budget crisis to another, you have a tendency to do things that begin to kind of bastardize the system, if I could use the term. In other words, the organizational structure becomes much more distorted. So sometimes don't try to consolidate or reorganize or try to re-engineer. Just go out and say, what should the structure look like? Stephen Pryor at the state level, at Commissioner of Education, has done the same thing. The central offices should be structured along functional lines, so as school improvement organizations, and we need to do it accordingly. The same thing with the funding of the schools. So we decided to do two things: deconstruct the central office and reconstruct it into a school improvement organization, and then create a funding formula so that the money follows the kids in a very transparent way. Two fundamental changes, and those fundamental changes I think will be lasting changes. We're about to do the same thing in our high schools. I mean, when students reach their senior year, when they reach their senior year, if they're on track, there's only one relevant course remaining to be taken: English 4, okay? Unless they're taking AP Honors Advanced Placement. So what happens is their entire senior year is they're taking irrelevant electives. I talked to this kid who was working in a restaurant. He was a senior. He told me his courses, one of the courses he's taking is woodshop. I have nothing against woodshop. But he's on his way to college. He could be taking an AP course, or he could be at Sacred Heart taking a college course for dual credit. So what we're going to do next year, and Bridgeport is small enough to do it, is we're going to, in effect, literally completely restructure our senior year. So all the kids will either be in college, on college campuses, on community college campuses, in technical training schools, in apprenticeship or pre-apprenticeship programs, or in paid work study programs. So that'll accomplish two things. It'll be a much more effective use of their time and more constructive for preparing them for the work world as well as for higher education. But it'll also allow us, in a district that's about 85% minority and about probably closer to 90% poverty, it'll create the expectation that high school is college, high school is a job. High school is a job training opportunity, so it'll just raise expectations dramatically. So those are two simple examples. And the great thing about Bridgeport is it's small enough where you can do it, and you could do it almost immediately.
Mr. Engler, how much of a problem is this skilled labor shortage? I mean, we have 8.3% unemployment. Wages are not going up. What is it that seems to be the obstacle? I hear from manufacturers all the time they can't get. I've heard. Yeah.
We have about 3 million jobs in America today that are unfilled.
But how could that be?
Because people don't have the training, and the skills that are required are very different. Take Bridgeport, I'll bet that the dropout rate, the ninth graders that never make it to the 12th grade, is a significant number. Mm-hmm. Who's going to hire them? The military doesn't even want those young people. So there's no place to send them, and they're going to become a problem. Then we've got the proportion that aren't planning on going directly to college. They need to go to the workforce, but they need to show up with more than a diploma that says I attended here for 4 years. And the wisdom in the approach that Paul's just outlined is that if you think about education, it's really a simple kind of formulation. The kids leaving high school age ought to be able to go to college without needing remediation. We got to get those millions back, billions as a nation. Or they ought to leave with a skill that's hopefully been measured and certified, a technical education, and the dropout rate needs to be zero. And if you could get there, you've sort of got it.
Is there anything you've seen that gives you hope that we can accomplish two of those three goals, let alone all three?
Yeah, I think that number one is that you think of what we do with the special education children in America today. We actually have an IEP. We have a plan, an individualized education plan for every one of those kids. We sort of need the same conversation with every other kid to say, what are you going to do? And we should not be saying you need to go to college. It's America. Anybody can go to college, but you can go at various points, as some have done. fact, some will go later. You can actually pay for it. You maybe have some income, but you need to be able to work. And I think what we've not linked together, and I think we now spend, I think as a result of some of the stimulus money, we're up to over $18 billion a year, 50 different job training type programs. But the integration of that to what is the need in Jane's old congressional district out in L.A. versus the Upper Peninsula of Michigan versus Bridgeport, Connecticut. There's different things, and we set up this elaborate network of workforce boards around the country, but the idea was to be able to assess local labor market needs, marry that then to the technical training. And I think what Paul's doing, really the community college network, if you will, needs to come down, and I'd even say in the junior and sophomore year, right, to help that kid have a rationale to stay in school and get a skill. Everybody's got to have a skill. And unfortunately, the community colleges, about 25% of their population are actually people with baccalaureate degrees. And bless their hearts, I mean, they got their degree, they did what they thought was the right thing, but they still don't have a skill. And so nobody needs them. And the skill, as Deborah would kind of was referencing, I mean, it's processing, it's computer literacy, technical skills. We're asking our manufacturers today to make 1 million widgets all perfect every time. I mean, the quality that's demanded there is simply remarkable, and you don't mail that in. That was the whole problem in the American auto industry. If you saw Sergio Marchionne on 60 Minutes over the weekend, it was terrific, but he talked about some of the skills that this workforce had, but how you had to bring the pride back, and you had to get the expectations set very high, and you cannot do that without people. And we have this opportunity. Demographics are actually with us. We literally need everybody going forward. And
Mr. Augustine, I think every report that you've written and every commission you've served on competitiveness has sooner or later talked about science and technical education. Are we doing anything right? Has anything gotten better in the years that you've been doing this?
I wish I could be more optimistic. There are bright spots. We all know about the Teach for America, the National Math and Science Initiative, but we have within the country as a whole 14,000 independent school districts. And if we fix them one at a time, that's going to take an awful long time. That's not going to work. When you address our schools and how they're doing, there are a couple of different aspects. One is the one Jane mentioned, that we badly need pipe fitters and welders, carpenters in this country that are really good and take pride in their work. Also, you might be surprised to know that on international standardized tests, if I were to ask you, American students, relatively speaking, do they do worse in math, science, or history? The answer is history. That should be a cause of great concern to us, but particularly to this group here. But I'd like to kind of focus on the math and science aspect of your question, because I think that based on the statistics I quoted before, that math and science is going to drive the ability of this country to be able to compete. And engineering I include as part of that. And I need to lay a little background as to why this is such a difficult problem to solve. My daughter, in her senior year in college, decided to be an attorney, and she was able to do that, and I'm very proud of her. My son had to decide in 8th grade to preserve the option to be an engineer, which he did. I was very proud of him. If you look at kind of the growth and of the process, the governor alluded to this. I calculated the other day, and these numbers aren't exact, they're from memory, but if you want to have one more researcher in engineering, i.e. he or she has to have a PhD, in the year 2029, you have to add 3,000 8th graders today to get that one additional one. The reason for that is that the fields are so hierarchical. Math is their language, and you can't say, I'll skip algebra and trig and start with calculus. And if you don't take algebra in 8th grade, you probably will never get back on the train of being a mathematician or a scientist or an engineer or what have you. So if you start out with 3,000 in 8th grade, about, I think it's like 2,100 of them will actually graduate from high school. Of those, something like 1,400 start college. and of those, about 120 say they're going to study math, science, or engineering. Just engineering, or going to study engineering. Of that 120, about 60 get their degree in engineering. Of that 60, about 20 go to work in the field as practicing engineers. About 2 of them go on to work for a PhD. The rest go to work on Wall Street or go to law school or medical school or whatever, which is fine, but they don't contribute to the field of engineering. Of the 2 that go on to get their PhD, 1 actually gets their PhD in engineering. That's why this is such a tough problem to solve. You don't turn this around overnight. In terms of, we all know about the quality of our K through 12 system. I don't need to quote the numbers, but we have a serious problem there. But we've not talked about this, but our universities today are in trouble. When we did the first Gathering Storm study, and when I first worked for Deborah on a study that her organization did, I don't think any of us imagined that our universities could ever be in trouble. They were the premier in the world. Today, some of our universities are quitting teaching engineering and science because they're very expensive to teach. Our universities are raising tuition. They're cutting back on faculty. Our universities that have been the bright spot are in trouble along with our K through 12. What do you do to fix K through 12? There's a very short answer to that. That is to bring the free enterprise system to K through 12. Free enterprise system, along with democracy, has made this country what it is. Somehow our educational system, K through 12, not our higher education system, but K through 12, has managed to totally escape the free enterprise system. And what do I mean by that? I mean you pay a physics teacher more than a phys ed teacher, you pay a great physics teacher more than a good physics teacher, and you fire a bad physics teacher. It's about that simple.
Thank you. I want to mention, Mr. Engler has to leave at 10:45, but it's not because of anything Norm Morgenstein said. He's going to advance the cause of American competitiveness in his day job.
Well, that's right. Our CEOs are doing their quarterly survey. That was set up a long time ago. So
right.
About
Jen, you want to respond? Then I want to ask you another
question.
question.
I just want to reflect on Norm's math, which I find extremely sobering. But it did also seem to assume a closed system, right? It assumed that we couldn't attract the best talent and keep it here. And I think this links to the panel on immigration later. It boggles my mind why we have highly skilled individuals who want to come to contribute to America, and we say no. We don't let them enter the country, and why we don't staple a green card to every graduate degree in the technical sciences. Just
well, John, let me ask you to speak to that, and not to the. I sense from the nodding here, we don't have to. We put that to a vote on the panel. I think I know which way it would go. Why? What is it about the politics of immigration that makes it so difficult for Congress to do what Jan just said?
it's electoral politics more than it is issue politics. That there are calculations made as to who can do better with the Hispanic vote by positioning themselves one way or the other, not to resolve the issue. John McCain laid on the barbed wire, 4 years ago, and they were trying to do it. The bill didn't come out of the Senate, and it was a big issue. And here we are 3 years later. There's no bill even now. The high end, there is 95% support just to the high end, but everybody says, I'm hanging on to that piece because it's such a darn good engine to haul the rest of comprehensive immigration reform. I think that the politics are nonsensical on immigration. I understand how people try to use it politically, but it is in the national interest to have a comprehensive immigration bill and get it done now. And it isn't that hard to do. And we believe at the roundtable this is an imperative for the nation for the reasons just mentioned here, and just simply for our. Look at the data. Look at California. Look at the innovation that's come out of people who weren't born here to start with and the companies they've built.
What is it about our political system that makes it so hard to do something that you say most people agree is in the national interest?
Political leadership. I mean, the calculation has been, it is crass partisan politics. Everybody wants to say, I'm for Hispanics or I'm for, this population, and look what I've done. You tell me. Let's be blunt. McCain tried it, and he got absolutely burned on this issue. Why didn't it pass the Senate when you had McCain and Kennedy with the president in support? Why? I would say that The leadership of the Senate at that time made the decision. I think there are people who have spoken, yes, publicly, but privately say, hey, this is too damn good of an issue to give up. Why hasn't the president in 3 years put a bill forward? I don't know.
My attempts here to get the blow on the embers here. So let me try again.
Then I'm getting out of here. I mean, but no,
Jan, I think
time.
one of the things that when the conversation, you're going to go?
I think I do have to go now.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
All right, you'll be done. Thank you for having me. And
Jan, let me ask you this. So. Are we becoming less innovative and entrepreneurial as a country?
I don't think so. Absolutely.
You do
no,
or you don't?
I genuinely do not. And I hear the sense of kind of depression coming in here, and I actually would put forward to you there's nothing, I mean, to paraphrase former President Clinton, there's nothing wrong with U.S. competitiveness that can't be fixed by what's right with U.S. competitiveness. The entrepreneurial system is extraordinarily vibrant. You know, I hear the conversation so far dividing into two categories, things that the government should do, but also some things that business can take on. And what we've been working on really is the latter. What can business do? Our working assumption, I mean, let's just, for the sake of argument, assume that nothing will happen in Washington for a while. And that sounds more facetious than I mean it, but you know, the dynamics, the dynamics that John just described, you know, are powerful. And are there things that business can do, which is innovative, entrepreneurial, is good for the business itself, is good for the country, and they're not currently doing? And I'd ask others on the panel to reflect on this. My emphatic answer is absolutely yes. And the idea is to actually go back to things that other panelists have mentioned before. It all goes back to this idea that there's a commons from which business draws, in which historically business invested deeply, from which business has withdrawn, because frankly, taken it a little bit for granted in the United States, and in which business needs to increasingly invest. And I see countless examples around the country that we're now documenting, myself and colleagues, where business has stepped up, right, and contributed back to the commons.
So give us a sense of some. I don't want to rely on the altruism of business. So you're saying it's in businesses' collective self-interest. What is in this commons that you think they're step back from?
This is not charity. This is not patriotism. This is good old-fashioned American self-interest that also builds the commons. And they refer to things that all of the panelists have already mentioned. Commons would include things like the innovation infrastructure that Norm mentioned, the K-12 education system that Paul mentioned, the availability of skilled labor that Deborah and others have mentioned. And the actual actions are things like the following. Setting up apprenticeships, right? We see in Charlotte Siemens doing that in a way that builds workforce for themselves and for others. Making sure that graduates of our public education system have the skills that business wants. So IBM is partnering with the Pathways to Technology Early College High School in New York to make sure that their graduates have those skills. And by the way, when they graduate, they've got a job interview with IBM. There are things like building up the local supplier base, recognizing that's what you draw from. And I have to actually tout the report that Deborah referred to earlier by the Council on Competitiveness, the MAKE report. I think it speaks to many of these kinds of things of building up the commons. You know, it's almost like like business built this magnificent apartment building, and we were really proud of it. And then through the forces of globalization, we started taking vacations to other countries, and we learned a lot there, and we admired things, and we got great things from that. And then we come home, and we look around, and we say, you know what? This place has gotten kind of run down. And the question is, what happens next? Do we fix up the building, or do we take longer vacations?
Paul, you?
I can't comment on that. I want to make a couple points because I want to get back to the issue of STEM and teacher pay.
Science and technology.
Science and technology and a few other things. First of all, we have to understand we will not eliminate the achievement gap unless we do universal early childhood education because 70% of the brain development, depending on what study you read, occurs between the ages of 0 to 3. And if you're going to really attack the issue of poverty, you have got to have universal intervention. We did a program called the Cradle to the Classroom program, and I've seen this program modeled in 5 or 6 different cities now, all with the same results. Pregnant teens are identified, babies are born, the pregnant teens are assigned a parent advocate, a lot of times another parent who has gone through the same experience. The babies are put in daycare, preschool, early literacy, early numeracy, early vocabulary, and the teens they attempt to get the teens back into school. In every program I've seen, the graduation rates among pregnant teens have gone from 20 to 90%, and we did it with 2,500 pregnant teens in Chicago, and there's no achievement gap in 3rd grade. So the deficiencies that we're seeing with the breakdown in the families, single parents raising children, 2-parent households, child neglected, you have got to do the intervention. No matter, you can be a miracle worker. Without that intervention, you're not going to get at this underclass of underachievers directly linked to poverty and dysfunctional families, and you have got to do that. So I just want to say that. And you know, it's an ounce of prevention. It's such a small investment and you don't need universal all-day preschool early childhood, although clearly that's designed to support the working parents. You're talking about 2.5, 3 hours of stimulus a day. If you guaranteed every child that type of intervention, you'd have a transformation effect. Let me talk about STEM, the issue with STEM. We know the models. We know the instructional models that can translate into high-quality math and science instruction. Having spent some time teaching in the service and things like that, I've seen just the miracles that the military training can do with young soldiers. I have a son who's in Afghanistan right now. He's a combat medic, and the way he was able to master that profession and trauma center medic, it was amazing what he was able to accomplish through that training. So we know the models that are there. We're not spending nearly enough time in math and science than we're spending in language arts, because it's like we have to teach children to read. I've got one group that wants to spend $14 million in a 3rd grade reading program, where for $14 million I can do a pre-K through 12 comprehensive curriculum reform and restructuring. I mean, I need the 1 year in Philadelphia, we got a 15 percentage point increase in our benchmark grade math scores, where the state, its improvement went 3%. It's because we spent 90 minutes a day on math. So the point is, time on task is absolutely critical. And then we've got to recruit STEM teachers. And let me make a comment about STEM. No matter what we try to do, we're never going to pay our teachers $100,000, $125,000, $150,000 a year, unless you're in Connecticut and you're a former administrator, because if your job's eliminated and you're thrown back into the classroom, you get to take your administrative salary with you. So we actually have some teachers who are making $100,000 a year. Go figure. But the point, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't have better pay for teachers, but the reality is, in upstate Louisiana, where they start teachers at $26,000, Bobby Jindal's not going to ever give them enough money to pay them $100,000. The corporations are not going to raise the money, and the local tax base is not going to generate that type of income. So it's just not going to happen. So what we've got to do is we've got to create a process by which we're recruiting the best and the brightest to the teaching profession, even if they're not going to stay a long time. A big myth is, my God, longevity translates into competency, and it does not. The effectiveness of teachers begins to seriously deteriorate in the 7th, 10th, 12th year. You know, look at the work that Ted Sanders has done and on basically teacher effectiveness. So what we've got to do is we've got to create this process that recruits individuals with math and science and engineering mastery into the teaching profession. Teach for America does it. The New Teachers Project does it. But we need to do it on a much more massive scale, where the subsidy is even less. And you know what? I don't want half of my teachers to teach for 20, 30, 40 years. Because if I do, my legacy costs will be so large, the class sizes will be rising, because the legacy costs and those long-term obligations will be exceeding far in excess of the property base. But if you have the right curriculum and instructional models, and if you allocate the appropriate amount instructional time on task, and you have the right accountability, if you recruit the best and the brightest, let them come in and do their 2 or 3 or 4 year Peace Corps duty in the schools. We have an unlimited number of young people that are knocking on that door, because then we can get those individuals coming into our schools with content area masteries. There's been some miracle schools in New Orleans because the charter schools out there are subject to an uncompromising accountability standard, contrary to what some of the anti-charter school blogs are saying. And they recruit, close to 75% of their teachers come through the alternative certification program. And, they don't stay more than 2 or 3 years. But the fact that they have such a superior system and that they're recruiting individuals with content area mastery into that system guarantees a continual level of competency and efficiency. I want to say one final thing. I have a niece who came through the new teachers program, and she has now taught for, I think, 3 years. And she's ready to leave now. She's done extraordinary work as a science teacher for 3 years. But she's at the point now where she's thinking of other things. There's other things she wants to do. She wants to have a family, etc. She feels that she can't devote the same intensive 6-day, 7-day-a-week energy that's needed to transform students, the majority of which are poor and the majority of which are far below grade level. Well, that's what we want. We want half of our teachers to be veterans who become lifelong teachers and become the future assistant principals and principals, administrators, superintendent. But we also want to constantly create this mechanism so that the best and the brightest, who are less concerned about salary and vacation time and whether or not Mardi Gras, they get the whole week off, or Jazz Fest the whole week off, or they're punching the clock, or they get irritated when you ask them to stay another hour for some supplemental instructional support at the end of the day. We want to recruit the best and the brightest into the system and not care if they don't stay long, because we have that continual pipeline. I think that's the approach that we have to take.
Deborah, I want to turn back to the question I asked Jan about innovation. You've been working on issues related to innovation, both in and out of the government, for many years. Do you look at America and say, we have troubles in our education system. We're not able to admit as many immigrants as many business leaders think we should. We have some credit problems that are starving startups. We have a lot of concern about whether sending all these people to Wall Street actually turned out to be a good thing in the long run. It certainly was a bad thing in the short run. How do you look at where we are on this innovation trajectory? Are we better? Are we at risk? Are we falling behind the competition?
Well, I'm going to side with Jan on the comment of being a little bit more optimistic. I mean, we have a lot of challenges. We've talked about them, but these are things that we could deal with. What we do have that's incredible is really a tremendous innovation capacity that if we got some of the friction out of the system, we've done some estimates that we're really seeing about $1.3 trillion in potential growth sitting on the table. And I mean, that's a staggering potential. And, when you think of the fact that we're in these tremendous scientific revolutions with the digital bio nanotechnology coming together, our rate of startup formation, new business formation is really unsurpassed. And I will say, at the Council on Competitiveness, we could spend most of our time receiving visitors from around the world who really want to understand what goes on in the United States to produce not just the Silicon Valleys, but really the game-changing thinking, that we're seeing in a lot of new space, whether it's biomimicry, of course, in some of the clean energy. But I mean, back to Steve Jobs. I mean, that was a technology play, but it transformed countless industries because of business management. So the innovation machine is really very vibrant in the United States. The areas where we do need to do some work certainly are in the pipeline coming in, but I think we need to focus a little bit more on the potential now. And it's good to concentrate on some of these challenges, but just back to the K through 12, I mean, there are a lot of roadmaps on what we need to do. It is a local issue still, and the STEM challenge, but let's think about how can we right now take advantage of the tremendous energy that's coming out of our universities for the entrepreneurial economy. So one thing I want to also suggest is that we're not doing a good job in linking small and medium and entrepreneurial firms to large-scale enterprises, to scale them up. The biggest challenge we have is a scale issue. And when I was a government official some years ago, I kind of broke my heart working on the flat panel display industry. Every single technology path of displays was invented in the United States. Liquid crystals, field emitters, plasma. We never commercialized them. We never manufactured them at scale. We lost all the innovation. And a lot of our data showing that in clean energy startups, when these firms are reaching $25 to $50 million in sales, they're all moving outside of the United States to Asia. And it's for some of the reasons we talked about earlier. So how do we forge a better partnership between the large enterprises and the emerging ones? And a practical example that has tremendous potential is an initiative now being piloted in the Midwest called Endemic, the National Engineering Manufacturing Digital Consortium, where the Council on Competitiveness has brought 4 major companies, Deere, Lockheed Martin, Procter & Gamble, and GE, who've each contributed on their own, in self-interest, $500,000, so a $2 million pool of resources matched by our Department of Commerce to actually get modeling and simulation tools into the supply chain of the medium and small manufacturers in the Midwest. And we're going to scale that up around the country, and it's going to be a huge innovation multiplier.
Thank you. I think we have about 10 minutes for questions, so if you have one, raise your hand and try to remember that a question ends with a question mark. Ma'am?
Thank you. As a former Board of Education president in a local community in New Jersey, I have a couple of points. One, I noticed that all of you described what was wrong with K-12, and none of you mentioned tenure. You described what was necessary. 3 years is appropriate. We don't want lifelong teachers. And as a president of the Board of Education, we couldn't make the appropriate changes because of tenure. And I was surprised that nobody said that word and walked around it. And I also wanted to give you just one small example. When you say you want teachers to come in for 3 years, I have a daughter who has a PhD, and she was in education, and she was hired in a particularly good school district in New Jersey, and they did team teaching. She had a child who was particularly gifted. The parent wanted to see if she could give her some extra work. She said, the class is too big, but I'll work with you and give you some things for her to do. She was promptly called into the superintendent's office because the other teachers were afraid they would be asked to do something extra.
Paul, do you want to have a
Let
brief
me respond.
response?
Yeah, first of all, when I talked about removing obstacles, I thought when you say you need to be able to hire, fire, promote based on qualifications and performance, that implies that you've got to make modifications in tenure. So I thought that was a given. Secondly, I believe you need a mix. I mean, there are school districts that simply can't recruit high-quality individuals. And then there are individuals who are recruited into the system that stay for 20 or 25 or 30 years, and it's literally impossible to get them out of the system without this prolonged process of evaluation and assessment. So what I'm saying is I think you need a mix. I'm saying we only want you for 3 years, but there's nothing wrong with recruiting. Just think if you created a system within which public employees over the next 30 or 40 years, 80% of them are not going to retire and basically, receive pensions and all those long-term benefits. And if public employment, public service was more mobile, in that in that large number of individuals entered public service and then moved on to other things, I mean, you would literally overnight, all the actuarial assumptions behind the long-term pension obligations would suddenly be transformed, and suddenly you wouldn't be driving these local taxes and local fees up. I just think that you need a mix. You need to recruit the best and the brightest, and a lot of times the best and the brightest will not come and become 20 or 30-year teachers. My niece was an extraordinary teacher, but she didn't want to be a teacher for life. She felt dedicating 3 years, working 7 days a week, doing all that, not worried about whether or not she was staying after school, and not having anybody intimidate her was the best way to do it. And I think that's what I'm referring to.
Great. There's a question. Gentleman on the aisle.
Thanks. So a growing number of scholars have pinpointed as one of the sources of decline in American competitiveness the loss of patient capital in the corporation. So just some numbers on that. Two processes behind that. The well-intentioned effort to increase the influence of shareholders in the boardroom, but that's coupled with the changing nature of the shareholder. So in 1970, a typical shareholder was like people in this room, and shares were held for about 6 years on average. Right. Now it's an institutional investor, pension fund, mutual fund, private equity firm, holds it for 6 or 7 months on average. And they're the dominant force in the boardroom now. And so, if your corporate asset is an apple orchard, what they would really like you to do is chop it down today and sell the wood for a profit rather than wait for 12 months for it to grow.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can we stop there? No more numbers.
Okay.
That was enough to work with.
All right.
Okay. You want to start, Jan, and then Norm?
Couldn't agree more. This is a short answer. And I'd actually point you to an article in Harvard Business Review that my colleague Mihir Desai has written recently, which basically argues it's even worse than what you've described, because then what we've done is we've outsourced the evaluation and compensation of management to the financial markets, which are short-term. So we've institutionalized the short-term nature and put it deep within the companies. I would argue that the only solution to this is for the monitors that we count on, the pension funds, the board of directors, to take back their responsibility for monitoring managers and making sure they've got a longer-term outlook. Couldn't agree more.
Mr. Augustine?
Yeah, I agree very much with the premise. A true story. When I was running Lockheed Martin, we thought we had some wonderful opportunities for advanced research. Research underpins innovation. It takes a long time. We were so excited, we sent our president to New York to brief Wall Street. He gave a great presentation about these ideas we had and how we were going to invest more in them. The audience, when he finished, literally ran out of the room and sold our stock. Stock dropped 11% in 4 days and continued down for 2 years before we got it back up. I had a friend who was in the room, who was an analyst in Wall Street. I asked him, we thought this was great. What did we say that was wrong? And I can almost tell you verbatim what he told me. He said, first of all, it takes 15 years for research to pay off if it pays off at all. He said, your average shareholder then owns your stock 18 months. He said, 15 years from now, they'll probably own Boeing stock, with all good respect, and they don't want you to have any good ideas then. Furthermore, they don't want to pay for it. And then he gave me the coup de grace, and he said, our firm just doesn't invest in companies with such short-sighted management. Those were his words. Now, I just have to finish that notion that business isn't going to solve that problem. I mean, the only way that could be changed, I've been pushing this for years with no effect, and that is change the capital gains tax rate so that if you hold an investment for 10 years, the tax rate is 1% on the gain. If you hold it 10 days, it's 99%. Then connect whatever curve you want to raise whatever amount of money you want. That would change the way CEOs and boards think.
Gentleman in the back, and then to the woman in the back.
It's a good segue into my question, which is really about tax rate. Earlier, there's a lot of comment on U.S. having the highest corporate tax rate in the world. However, reading trade press like the Wall Street Journal, it would say that actually corporations pay significantly less than that statutory tax rate, and their effective tax rate is much lower, and in some cases, for sophisticated companies like many of the members of the Business Roundtable, zero. Given that scenario, how is a high statutory tax rate that no one pays an impediment to business?
A quick answer is that corporations manage their business to optimize tax rate as opposed to optimizing competitiveness.
Right. That's the
So another way of saying what Engler said, he wouldn't say it this way. They don't propose to raise the effective tax rate of American corporations. If it's going to be revenue neutral, it's not going to raise the effective tax rate. It will. There are some people who are paying 0, and there are some people who are paying 40%. It will even out. And the reason it's not going anywhere is the guys who pay 40% are ready to change the system, and the guys who pay 0 aren't. And so they don't exactly have a united front when they go to the Ways and Means Committee. I think there's a woman over there, and then we'll go over here.
Thanks. In the political discourse on these issues, especially as they center on jobs and the offshoring of manufacturing, a lot of attention is put on China's practices. To what extent is it about legitimately or is there a need to legitimately call for a level playing field, so that we can all be competitive playing the same game by the same rules? And to what extent is it using China as a scapegoat for issues that are really issues about American competitiveness?
Deborah?
Well, I think the issue around Chinese currency manipulation has a little bit of a scapegoat quality to it, although it has a huge impact on costs. But a real serious issue that I was going to mention, and I'm glad you asked your question, is we've lost a lot of our leadership on trade liberalization and leading the world on some of the multilateral and bilateral trade rules of the road, as it were. In the case of China, and most experts on both parties in the trade community will say this, we made a huge mistake in the Clinton administration when China was brought into the WTO and did not have to sign up to the Government Procurement Code. It gives them the complete authority legally to do all indigenous innovation, to basically protect their industries, require, these huge infrastructure projects to be done. And also, of course, linked to that is the really pernicious practices around intellectual property and cyber. And again, we're talking about supply chains, the cyber, and, I think virtually every company with non-classified networks is compromised right now in security. Most of those attacks coming from China and Russia. So the Chinese situation is really serious. They're determined to be innovators. They have a whole concept around maximizing for production, attracting high-value investment, but they want to move up to the curve of where we are. So that's why we've got to get our act together on all the things we've been talking about today.
Mr. Agassi?
Very briefly, as Deborah says, China is clearly a challenge in this regard. But I think it's important to remember, China doesn't run our public schools. China doesn't determine our tax rate, our patent policy, what our corporations invest in research, and so on. We have met the enemy, and it's us.
There's a question over here. Can you take the mic, please?
Thank you. I'm now a private banker, but many decades ago I was a teacher. For 3 years as a Peace Corps volunteer, for 2 years in a private school in Shaker Heights, Ohio, and spent 15 years on the board of trustees of a school that my children went to here in Washington. And all that time, I've never heard anyone, until you spoke now, Paul, talk about what happens before a child gets into the classroom. In the first 5 years, and then in the 16 hours a day a child spends outside of school. Are there programs, is there any kind of movement to address this, especially among people who are living in poverty, where the poverty that children face coming into school is so enormous it's almost impossible to overcome it, no matter how good the school is?
Yeah, it's more talk than reality. There are some movements. Secretary Duncan has been trying to shift more of the focus, more attention on early childhood education. You've got the Great American Cities Grant going out that's going to identify school districts that to be pilots where the foundations and these organizations can actually flood money into those districts. We're hoping Bridgeport will be one, where we'll be able to do a universal early childhood education program for about 5-6 years from prenatal all the way through on, and demonstrate beyond a reasonable doubt that this is where the investment should go. But I'll tell you the fundamental problem is, if you really want to solve the problems of public education in this country, pass a constitutional amendment to lower the voting age to like 3. And I think your problem will be solved. The educational constituency is diminishing in terms of size and representation. And look, there is nobody who is a stronger advocate for charters than I, or has chartered more schools than I. Just don't do it. I'm just not so public about it. And for that matter, is a stronger supporter of school choice. I've never opposed vouchers. I support anything that expands school choice. But fundamentally, we're beating around the bush unless we get at the problems of poverty in the underclass, and we can only do that through universal early childhood education. The program that I talked about, the Cradle to the Classroom program, which has in Chicago, was started by a welfare mother in Robert Taylor Holmes, Virginia, New York, who ended up at Georgetown University, incidentally, and all the parent advocates were welfare mothers from the housing development that has since been torn down. And when we brought that program to, well, we didn't bring it to scale, but 2,500 is a large number, and it had those phenomenal results. 2-3 years later, after my departure, that program was dismantled, and Virginia is now helping me in Bridgeport. But that alone, imagine if you could have done that for every one of the pregnant teens and gotten the graduation rate to 90% and had no achievement gap at third grade. There's this big myth that the achievement gap shows up at third grade, and somehow there's this big divide that occurs after that. It's an illusion, because the reason that there's such a contrast in third grade is that's when the kids take the tests independently for the first time. The gap begins during the ages of 0 to 3, so you need to invest in that area.
Okay, so if you say you didn't get any new ideas here, just remember, lower the voting age to 3. It'll solve everything. I think we ought to cut it off about 18, too. The gentleman there, I'm afraid that'll be the last question.
How can we compete with countries that are saving over 40% of their GDP and investing about the same level? And in the process also having a common strategy in which the government and private sector in some way partner, so you don't have to rely on the common good or the voluntary investment only of the private sector in the common good, but really invest as a society for the common good.
Yeah.
Boy, that's a very difficult one. I think you've hit part of the nail right on the head, that we do have to invest more deeply. We've got to create the incentives in our society to. Things like consumption taxes may very well point in that direction. But my hope is that folks understand that what we're facing here is not simply low wages. I think we've been saying we're losing jobs because of that, when in fact it is deeper things we're losing because of availability of skilled workforce, the deterioration of the commons, the inability to invest deeply.
I'm going to thank the panelists, including Mr. Engler isn't here. I don't believe in panels that are this big, but I thought this group did a very good job of keeping their answers to it. Thank you.